we were just in East Tennessee for the first time.
Wait, where?
Knoxville.
Oh my God.
Together were the speakers at the spring conference of the Appalachian Psychoanalytic Society, which was awesome. It was so fun. And then I was reading your longer bio and I was like, I got to ask you. I was like, we've just been to East Tennessee for the first time and so beautiful.
It was gorgeous.
So wait, so where was it? Where was it held? Was it in Knoxville proper, like at UT Knoxville? Or
Not
what?
at UT, but at a nature center.
Okay. Was it IAMS?
Is that
Yes,
how
that's
you
exactly
pronounce
right,
that?
yeah.
Yes, I did.
Yes. That is where, like in elementary school, I would go for like field trips. Like IAMS Nature Center. That's amazing. You were totally in my hometown, basically.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's amazing. Yeah.
I grew up kind of an exurb of Knoxville. It's so dope. Yeah. I'm glad you liked it. It's an odd place now, but
it was beautiful.
Yeah.
And we were there for what was the name of the music festival?
It involved ears, maybe.
Oh yeah. Big Ears.
Big Ears.
Right?
Thank you, Big Ears.
Yeah, which is wow. You two are so much hipper and cooler than I'll ever be. Was it awesome?
We didn't get to go.
Okay.
That's pure
it was
projection.
just at the same time.
We saw people streaming into the downtown area as we went to bed at about 9. That was
okay.
Yeah, but you know what was amazing was we were having dinner with several members of the Appalachian Psychoanalytic Society, an amazing group of people. And then because of the festival, other people walking down the street just happened to be part of the Appalachian Psychoanalytic Society. And we were just like, what sort of wonderful bubble have we wandered into? Everyone here is a psychoanalyst who's going to see live music. It was amazing.
Wild.
I'm like trying to comprehend my hometown having both like the overlap of like a cool music event and the Appalachian Psychoanalytic Society. I gotta admit, I'm having a little bit hard time reconciling that image in my brain because it's like so, like literally, we were just joking about hot cross buns. My memories of Tennessee is suburban Tennessee with hot cross buns and church barbecues.
Right.
But I hope you got to go. Maybe you didn't get a chance to go to Dollywood, the best place.
No, I wanted
to.
We want to go back.
We didn't, but what we did get to do, and this is relevant to this little creature who I'm this turtle who I'm holding up that listeners cannot see, but Patrick does talk too fast, and so I do wave a turtle or like a picture. I have also like a picture of a turtle. And he was talking too fast during this presentation. And so 2 of the really wonderful graduate students said, we can take you to visit a turtle because we were at a nature center. So they took him to meet a snapping turtle named Shelleen, like Jolene, but Shelleen, to slow down.
And she had there was a little like Dolly Parton sort of shrine / meme saying, just don't, it punned on the song in some way that I've forgotten, being like, don't throw rocks. Shelleen apprecicates her tank being, clean.
I assume this was like 1,000% earnest, like the relationship between.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, like, like there's no irony.
No,
it's like
zero irony. No. It was like Dolly says, like, leave Shelleen alone.
And Shelleen was magnificent.
She was magnificent.
She had a very long neck. I didn't realize how long the neck of a snapping turtle could get. She was sort of floating there, kind of,
and then poking the head out or something.
Yeah, poking her head out just above water, and perhaps it was also like the parallax effect of looking down into the tank. But she seemed to have like a good foot-long neck. It was more like a Loch Ness monster kind of situation, but with really.
This is a real encounter.
Yeah, I loved it.
It was.
This was like slow reading the turtle.
I mean,
it's kind of amazing.
It was an analytic encounter, right? Yeah. You both emerged changed.
Well, maybe there's a through line here because I was looking for I was immediately like, I like these turtles. Maybe I want a turtle in my life, and so I multiple mornings of like getting up at 5 o'clock and instead of doing anything useful, spending about an hour and a half learning about different turtle breeds and pets. And eventually I realized this is not the way to go. And then I started reading a book by Cy Montgomery of Time and Turtles, lovely little book about turtles. And I learned from a pair of turtle rescuers who she profiles that one thing one does if you encounter a turtle, right? Because apparently there is a daily carnage of turtles on the highways and tracks of our great nation, is you're supposed to pick them up and move them. The thing is, though, that when you pick them up, you want to keep them facing in the direction that they were originally going. Because if you orient them around too much, or if you pick them up in a way where they, like, God forbid, get flipped, which could actually injure them, apparently their intestines can dislocate, which is a really horrible thing, but they lose their bearings. So I've had an encounter too with a snapping turtle where I like let it cross the road. But I found myself thinking about this in relation to like one of the motifs in your lovely piece, which was this idea of like getting going and like getting stuck or just having some sort of obstacle, and whether it be external, internal, or some interface between the two, and then just having this inertia, and all sorts of people can be there to, get you going. And that could, you just don't want to disorient them too much, but you also want to keep an eye on like where they were originally going, or at least what they wanted.
Yeah. And don't derail the turtle.
Yeah.
Let you do you is what kids these days say, right? And we let the turtle do turtle.
I love it.
All right, shall we?
Oh.
That was really well timed.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so excited to introduce Kevin Duong, who has kindly agreed to talk with us today after we reached out to him, freaking out about how amazing his essay in Parapraxis, Broke Psychoanalysis, is. Kevin teaches political theory and intellectual history at the University of Virginia. He's currently writing a book on anti-colonial psychoanalysis and the surrealists in the middle of the 20th century. He also has a 2020 book, The Virtues of Violence, Democracy Against Disintegration in Modern France. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Broke Psychoanalysis and the Lafargue Clinic, and really anything else that we get to today. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here since I'm a very loyal listener to the podcast. So
that means the world to us, all the more so. And I just want to say this is one of the best, if not the single best, like analytic essay that I've read in as long as I can remember. Honestly, it's been years, and it's
totally cosign.
Yeah, in terms of the content, in terms of the material, in terms of structure and all that, but just above all, to the thing that I wanted to commend to our audience to do, because they may even want to do this. They want to pause this and then check it out and come back.
We're going to send it out on Patreon first, also too. We'll share the essay. Yeah,
it's just to go off and read it because like it's incredibly readable and lucid, and it's almost crystalline in its accessibility, and it's very, very frank. It's something I'm going to be using to teach, but also I found like one thing that we've always been talking about on the podcast is like whether the public facing, or at least the publicly legible psychoanalysis of yore, right? And we go back to like Winnicott on the radio.
We don't actually say wither and yore usually.
No, Usanle. No.
Usanle neige j'entends.
Yeah, but there, I've been at pains to see anything like it in the present moment. And then I just read this, which was involved history, was immediately cogent to the present, and was just something that I could give to someone who knew precious little about psychoanalysis or even nothing about psychoanalysis. And they would be like, this is a cool thing in its own right. And I want to learn more about psychoanalysis, and it's beautifully written too. So I just thought it was a trifecta on those fronts as really just great stuff.
Yeah.
Awesome thing. It is, maybe we'll talk about it. It's actually connected. So it means a lot to me that you actually would say that, because it's actually, my relationship to the history of psychoanalysis is a little bit complicated, and part of it has to do with my commitment to lucidity.
Mm-hmm.
So we could talk about that at some point, but it means a lot to me that you could write something about psychoanalysis that someone who didn't know much about psychoanalysis couldn't really understand why psychoanalysis mattered. Absolutely.
And I'm sure we're going to get to this in a little bit, but also for me, it was really, as somebody, like I've probably said this in like a lot of episodes, because whatever I'm teaching is always informing what it is that I'm talking about on the podcast, but I'm teaching this Marx, Nietzsche, Freud seminar now. And I have an incredibly wonderful group of students. They'll go anywhere that I can take them. But I still think that it's really hard to get someone to immediately see the stakes of like why the 20th century like project of how do we marry Marx and Freud, or is that even possible? Like why that matters.
Yeah.
So being able to like cut to the heart of that while also, learning so much about this clinic that I used to commute through Harlem.
You probably walked right by it like 100 times.
Yeah. I had no idea. We'll stop embarrassing you by telling you how much we like your work and start, being in a normal academic mode by making you answer questions.
Sure.
So,
Thank you both. That means a lot.
can you tell us a little bit about your path to psychoanalysis in, whatever way you think about that, and more specifically to studying the Lafargue Clinic?
Sure. I mean, it actually directly connects to what you both were just talking about. I will freely admit that I came to psychoanalysis late because, and I think this, what I'm about to say is probably the experience of a lot of people. I went to graduate school, and frankly, even when I was an undergraduate, at a time in which your credentialing into the life of the mind was learning that Marx and Freud were wrong. So
Yeah.
I'll be totally honest. Like, so for example, was I taught Freud? No, I was taught the feminist critiques of Freud. I was taught
Same.
Freud, like Cixous and Enrique, et cetera. Was I taught Marx? No, I was taught the critics of Marx. Given Foucault right off the bat, did you know the repression hypothesis is totally crap because in fact the soul is invented through discourse or something like that. So a lot of my path to psychoanalysis has actually been this really amazing experience of unlearning my own intellectual formation. I say that with deep love and admiration for my original teachers who brought me into the life of the mind, partly through these critiques. But the price paid for that particular path into the life of the mind was actually thinking that people like Marx and Freud were totally passé. And so I totally admit that my path to psychoanalysis came late, already when I was a professor. I can almost, it's not quite a primal scene, it's a primal essay. This one essay that made me think that I was not taught this stuff properly and that I should read it more closely. And it's actually Althusser's essay, Freud and Lacan. Because it is that essay that, it happens in just a few beautiful paragraphs where it says, what is the object of psychoanalysis? It is the price that we pay for becoming creatures of language and the contract we make with language in order to gain the capacity to say certain things while the inability to say other things. And the object of psychoanalysis is to inventory what happens to us in virtue of gaining the power to speak. And I was like, why? This is amazing. And if someone had put it that way to me earlier, then I would have totally been on board. And then he has these beautiful digressions that not everyone can fully heal from the wounds of having paid the price of becoming a creature of language. And I was like, that is the most succinct and beautiful portrait of what this crazy tradition is actually after.
Yes.
And I taught it in a class on the 20th century French thought. And the students were moved. And they too had certain ideas about what studying psychoanalysis was supposed to be. And had also encountered the incredibly dense, impossible to understand, high barrier of entry, psychoanalytic theory. And then they read the essay and they were like, holy moly. We didn't even know this was something people could study.
Yeah.
So that it's funny. It was that one essay, and even just a certain part of that one essay that then made me think, wait, I should probably actually really go back and learn this stuff properly. And then the other thing I'll say is then what a relief it was to find out, and this is something I care about politically and intellectually in a larger sense too, that psychoanalysis could be beautiful in a public language of social criticism in the mid-century in a way that it stopped becoming, frankly, the more that it moved into the academy. I'm not interested in judging whether that was a good or a bad move, but the fact that psychoanalysis could be a public vocabulary for people to try to understand what was happening to them, and then it becomes impenetrable 30 years later, seems to me maybe something we should think really hard about. And so part of the coming my way back to psychoanalysis, and it really was just maybe 4 or 5 years ago, was reading the mid-century stuff and this is for people to read who do not have a major background in psychoanalysis, are definitely not physicians, and who are giving them a vocabulary for talking about the world that is rapidly changing around them and trying to understand where they fit in and what it was doing to them. And so funny enough, I skipped psychoanalysis straight to surrealism actually in my own research. So I was interested in mid-century surrealists and the way that they're tackling these problems. And of course, they're obsessed with Freud. The First Surrealist Manifesto flat out says Freud is the one who taught us that the importance of reclaiming the rights of the imagination. I was like, oh, okay, all these things are happening in my life that are telling me that I should actually just go back and read Freud. And so I was looking in the letters of Ralph Ellison because I knew that he was really interested in Freud and Marx. And I was trying to parse this question. What did mid-century people think Freud and Marx had to teach them in a way that I had missed because of my own intellectual formation? And there was a reference to the clinic. And I was like, what is this clinic? And then after digging around, I realized that the papers of the clinic, they're scattered at a couple different archives. Some of the main papers are at the Schomburg in New York City. Wortham's paper are actually at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Some of the other clinicians' papers are scattered about to a bunch of smaller places. And I put it temporarily on hold. It's like, no, I don't have time to gallivant around and collect all this stuff. And then actually COVID hit. And weirdly, it was actually a chance for me to do a ton of archival work for lots of logistical reasons about classes moving online, et cetera.
Sure.
And so I basically spent 2 years kind of unexpectedly going around collecting materials and papers for both the clinic itself and its various clinicians. And that was how I stumbled on the Lafargue Clinic, a really roundabout way in the kind of best of all possible. I mean, it's exactly how I'd want to stumble on a research topic.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had no idea that this was what I was going to study. And then 2 years later, I'm like as happy as I can be because I'm having just a blast.
The history of the Lafargue Clinic it's really remarkable. I mean, it brings together these figures that I think our audience will probably know. So Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Thurgood Marshall, as well as figures like Frederick Wortham, who was new to me and will likely be new to our audience. So by way of kind of, getting all of this out on the table, can you tell us the story of the clinic, which you situate, you see some of its origins in Freud's 1918 call for quote unquote psychotherapy for the people. So can you tell us the story of the clinic from there to the immediate context of its founding? And also perhaps a little bit about what resistances it faced in getting started and how its founders responded to those.
Sure. Happy to. Maybe I'll take this. The story comes from a couple different angles too.
Please,
I mean, I think
however you want.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. The 1918 speech, it's a bomb. And I know a lot of other historians of psychoanalysis have written on it that actually, the Lafargue Clinic is not the only one. Immediately after the 1918 speech, there's an explosion in places that lean social democratic.
Yeah.
To set up these kind of free clinics. And what's interesting to me is they're free clinics, but they don't actually rethink much like the clinic's physical and organizational form itself, which I'll talk about.
Yeah.
But there's obviously a generational explosion of these clinics that take really seriously that mental health care ought to be mass provisioned and it ought not to be monopolized by just wealthy people who have the money to pay for analysts. Wortham is German-born. He's born in Bavaria. And he, even when he's, I think he's studying in Britain if I'm remembering this, when World War I breaks out. And he's actually just training in general to be a physician. He's actually in touch with both Freud and Ernest Jones. Actually, Ernest Jones, I think in 1917, sends him like a reading list being like, dear young wannabe physician Wortham, you need to read Morton Prince, Freud, Ferenczi. And it's like a pretty long reading list. Actually, it's like a bit of like a comprehensive exams reading list for those of you who are graduate students in the audiences.
I mean, on this podcast, we stand anybody who's like just sending out unsolicited reading advice.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Well, maybe that's what folks who love psychoanalysis also love doing.
Yes.
Wortham gets this giant list, and he's already interested in psychoanalysis and radical culture, and he's also beginning to become interested in socialism.
Mm-hmm.
So he's actually studying in Britain, and he starts getting involved in Fabian socialist circles, that kind of thing. He eventually emigrates to the United States in the 1920s, first to Baltimore to actually study with Adolf Meyer, who's this major, actually, among other things, a teacher of psychoanalysis at Johns Hopkins. And that's where Wortham first gets analytic training under Horace Frink, who's the famous and maybe kind of notorious Freud student. It's a catastrophic case of Freud's treatment. And Frink is actually Wortham's psychoanalysis teacher. The real story gets going, which is that in 1932, Wortham, along with a lot of European emigres, Frank, they're going to New York City. Mm-hmm. Wortham gets a job at Bellevue Hospital. And pretty soon after he arrives in New York City, he starts floating the idea of opening up a free psychiatric clinic in this tradition that he has actually, at this point, grown up around of provisioning free psychiatric care in New York City. And when you read the letters, it's totally clear that he is stonewalled from every philanthropic organization in New York City. Some of them flat out make fun of him for his request. There's one particularly notorious case that's recounted in a magazine article that one philanthropist even jokingly accuses Wortham of practicing racial segregation, precisely because he wants to open up a clinic in Harlem and therefore is doing like race-based special treatment. He applies to the Marshall Field Foundation. They shoot him down. A lot of these are really powerful liberal elites.
Yeah.
In New York City, who have their own politics around the hospital system and mental health care in the city. Wortham basically spends 10 years desperately trying to find someone to give him some funding sources to opening up a psychiatric clinic. And at this time, he's becoming really close friends with Richard Wright, who's also puzzled and angry that this is so hard to do. And so the breakthrough comes when the St. Philip's Episcopal Church, it's Reverend Bishop, they actually have a history of helping tone down and even mediate gang violence in Harlem. This is what Reverend Bishop is actually known for in the Harlem community. And Richard Wright knows him, I think, through some connections. And so Wright, Wortham, and the third person, Hilda Moss, who eventually becomes the chief physician of Lafargue Clinic, the three of them go to the church and they're offered the basement of the parish house as a free clinic space. Sad because, Abby, if you actually walked by it, you won't have walked by the parish house anymore. The church is still there, but the parish house was demolished and it's currently paved over as a parking lot, which is so horrible. And I'm like, I wanted to like email someone and say, we have to put a plaque of where this clinic used to be now that it's just a bunch of cars parked. So they're given the space, and the thing that we'll talk probably a lot about, but the immediate thing they know is that they have two scarcity problems they have to solve in order to pull off this clinic. They have no money because at this point, no philanthropist has offered to help them. So everyone's going to work for free. They have the basement clinic for free and they're going to charge nothing. So it's like not clear how any money is going to ever be exchanged, except for
when they give people cab fare to go home. That was an amazing detail.
So there's it's almost like a muffin jar, and like you put in like what you can pay, and then they just pull right out of it in order to pay people's fare home. Or there's no money involved, but it's also a time thing. So the only reason the clinic also works is because all of the volunteer staff and the clinicians, they have full-time jobs at other hospitals and clinics. So Wortham and Moss work at Bellevue. Ernst Jolovich is one of the other he's the most orthodox psychoanalyst of them all, runs a private practice during the day. And so they have to run the clinic after hours when they do their other jobs that they get paid to do in order to actually live. So the clinic is this really complicated thing that is parasitic on the fact that its staff do not depend on the clinic for their livelihoods, that they earn their money elsewhere, which is why the clinic ran for 12 years from roughly 6 to 8 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays when they finished their other jobs. The resistances, I just mentioned that the philanthropists are fully against it. Soon after the clinic actually opened, there's a competitor clinic that is run by a different set of political forces called the North Side Center, also in Harlem. And we don't have to, fully get into the history, but it's part of the internal politics of Harlem politics itself. Because, frankly, the Lafargue Clinic is really left-wing. It doesn't have a lot of popular support from, for example, politicians. And so when the Lafargue Clinic opens, it is the only mental health care facility in all of Harlem. But I think it's 2 years after it opens that the competitor clinic, the North Side Center, opens. And so the other resistances actually come from internal to the mental health care community itself, which is it's driven by its own, as you might imagine, really intense Cold War political divisions. And those political divisions of the American Cold War fractured the mental health care community in a way that almost maps onto the clinics they end up running. I'll just add this one final thing about difficulties of running this clinic. They apply for funding from the state in the mid-50s, and they are always denied funding because they cannot produce a budget. which is hilarious.
Right.
They're like, of course we do not have a budget. We have no money. Why we are asking you for money. We cannot produce a budget. And 2 years in a row, I think they're denied on this frivolous grounds. And I can only assume it's also political, that this was just an alibi or an excuse to not offer them New York State support, which the other, like for example, the North Side Center received.
I was wondering about the inspiration just for the name of the clinic itself, which comes from a leftist political tradition, and I was hoping you would speak to. Yeah.
So yeah, Paul Lafargue, communard, Marxist son-in-law, most famous, to the extent that we could say he's famous, for this kind of hilarious manifesto, The Right to be Lazy, which has these amazing passages like, he's haranguing the 19th century working class. He's like, these people are hungry, so what do? They bang on the doors of the factories, demanding that the doors of the factories be open so they can work, so that they can get money to then eat. He's like, or we can be like the Spaniards who just have like long, languorous breaks and like enjoy life. But Paul Lafargue started off as a physician, and he's also mixed race. And he was this amazing symbol for the clinic. In many ways, that kind of personification of a lot of their revolutionary hopes, that you could have a multiracial left-wing clinic that believed that the provisioning of care was a critical part of an emancipatory politics. And Lafargue's face is plastered on their Christmas cards. His face is framed on their wall. And you can tell that Americans are a little bit confused about why this clinic is named after Lafargue, because they either keep misspelling it, like Lafarge, F-A-R-G-E. And in my mind, I free associate to Fargo, like the town. So like in my mind, it's always like this kind of like confusing, like why are they misspelling the name? Or they'll just put Lafayette Clinic. It happens at least once. It's like, well, a random French guy that the clinic is named after. And this is one final thing about the resistances to the clinic. They know why they named the clinic after Paul Lafargue. Yeah. But actually, as far as I can tell, not a single newspaper article or magazine article ever about the clinic says that Lafargue is Marx's son-in-law. They always say he's a Cuban mixed race physician. They always omit his communist connections. And I can't help but feel that is a clear sign that the Cold War is impinging.
Yeah.
The clinic, that they strategically don't correct the record, because by the time, the years of the clinic, 46 to 58, overlaps with McCarthyism and the Red Scare. So they are both owning their affiliation with the revolutionary left tradition of psychiatric care in an American context in which that is actually really dangerous. And so Time magazine, Amsterdam News, even some of the international papers that cover the clinic never say that Lafargue is Marx's son-in-law. I can't find a single one.
It's amazing because then you, as you find from places like Time magazine, you instead get lines like, what's this? This is from Earl Brown, describing the Lafargue Clinic as, quote, one of the most democratic places on earth. And this is not an overstatement, which is a hell of a thing to hear in the pages of, I don't know, a magazine that would have Ike on the cover about this enterprise. I'm honestly like momentarily speechless, just contemplating that could happen.
It's wild. I mean, everyone knew at some level that this was a really radical experiment, but you could also tell there's a pressure to frame it in a certain way. So, for example, they really need it to be an example of American radicalism.
Right.
They really have to deny the fact that this clinic is half international, half American, and that has connections to the international left. So they can say it is the most democratic place on earth, and they really mean it too. I actually want to really emphasize, like Earl Brown and Amsterdam, and like some of the magazines that write about it, understand that something really important is happening at this clinic, but they also need it to be a weapon in the Cold War. That this radical democratic experiment is happening in the United States, aka not in other places in the world, in a Cold War world in which is riven between democracy and its critics, supposedly between East and West, which is, I think, why the fact that the clinic is connected to this much longer radical tradition that comes both out of Freud's 1918 speech, as well as the Lafargue communist tradition, kind of gets downplayed.
I want to get into brokenness, right? That's in the title, and as you very frankly observe that the task that confronted the Lafargue Clinic was do psychoanalysis for people who are broke by creating an institution that is itself so broke that, as we've just learned a minute ago, they literally cannot produce a budget, right? I was just envisioning like submitting a budget with just like all zeros or like, and maybe like negative or like, yeah, exactly. But broke doesn't mean broken, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things that was so interesting to me reading this piece, in addition to the ways that it made these like seemingly abstract theoretical, conversations about like, how do you make Marx and Freud like work together? It's radical in terms of how it operates. I was hoping you can tell us and our listeners a little bit about how the clinic operated, what day-to-day practice looked like there. And in particular, if you can kind of walk us through how the clinic's approach involved reconfiguring classical psychoanalytic theory, especially in terms of transference.
Yeah.
And also like its use of its physical space. A state of affairs that you describe as, and now I'm quoting you, not the abolition of authority, but its multiplication.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's actually the part that I think I was most thrilled of thinking through about the clinic, which is the fact of its physical space.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll talk about that. What might an ordinary patient experience if they walk into the clinic?
Yeah.
You go through basement halls that are dark. You break into, I think it's 2 rooms with pipes overhead and bright lights. They often describe what they do as psychoanalytic psychiatry, which often means that they have a psychoanalytic theory of the subject, but their actual treatments look more like what we'd associate with psychiatry today.
Mm-hmm.
And part of this has to do with their constraints. So they have 2 rooms. One-on-one treatment is not going to work. You literally do not have the physical space for it. You have to rethink that. So that's one thing they have to rethink. They immediately get overwhelmed with patients. So many. And they feel a responsibility that they have. Part of the dream here is the mass provisioning of mental health care. So one-on-one treatment that also happens multiple years, and then you only have a very limited set of patients, that's not going to fly either. So you'll walk in. Normally you'd have an intake interview, normally with someone like Wortham, where they almost like a classic an interview process where you'd get both how do you feel, what are you here for, but also family history stuff, like a very old school early psychoanalysis. We need like family history.
Yeah.
Where'd you grow up? Tell me about your parents, blah, 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 blah. What do you do for your job? What jobs have you had in the past? From there, it would branch out into several different ways, which are all really interesting. This is I know, I'm sure many listeners know this, and you too do, which is that the line between psychoanalysis and actually prescription psychiatry is not a bright line at this point. So normally patients would be prescribed a mixture of anti-anxiety medication as well as some form of mental health care treatment. This can take the form of something as simple as getting employment assistance through a social worker who's on hand, because they had this idea that actually people are able to control their neuroses better when they actually have a little bit of control over their lives. And a big part of that in mid-century Harlem is actually just holding down a job.
Yeah.
For some people, it would actually look more like a traditional psychoanalysis, although that was rare simply because of the labor resources. And in many instances, they would refer patients to analysts who are willing to take folks on for no cost or low cost. The most interesting major solution they do is group play therapy for children. A humongous portion of their patients are kids in the Harlem community of all races. And one way they deal with their space constraint is they actually do play therapy, because you can have like 12 kids playing together, watching and observing and helping them all 12 at a time. So you could think of it, and it is important to see it on one hand as a solution for efficiency. But what they really quickly discover is a lot of the kids, for example, have speech impediments. The talking cure actually doesn't exactly work if you are dealing with kids with speech impediments. A lot of the children had learning disabilities. Dyslexia is actually fairly common among them. And the clinicians realize that play therapy is actually a way of having kids enter into language that's easier than the traditional analysis. And what I love about this is they start off thinking of their space as a constraint, and they really quickly learn that it's teaching them something really important about what it means to actually provide care for people for whom their classic talking cure is not going to fly. So a child with a debilitating speech impediment, rather than sitting for 40 sessions and saying nothing, will play with blocks. Mm-hmm. And they will look at the way the children play with blocks as its own form of associative speech. In fact, they designed a bunch of diagnostic tests around play, watching kids play with blocks or with art drawings. Mm-hmm. They did a lot of art therapy.
Yeah.
And so this was, I think, a magnificent, they're not alone in doing this, but it's a magnificent breakthrough because it's one of these many examples that I love about the clinic where they let the constraints teach them something new, that they don't just sit there complaining, we can't do the kind of analysis we were taught to do. We have to do something. And then they start realizing that there are therapeutic possibilities that come in all shapes and sizes, that they have to learn to move that to their advantage. So the group therapy is one of the really, a group play therapy is one of the really big things they do. And then maybe the final thing I'll add, this is probably what they're most famous for, are their famous evening seminars. So they would treat patients from 6 to 8 p.m. And although sometimes, as you might guess, they never really quite closed up at 8. And then because they only have 2 rooms, they would reorganize all of the chairs and the screens in the room to turn it into a giant seminar room where, with the consent of the patients and normally the kids' parents, they would have a research session where the patient would actually participate in trying to understand their own difficult case. These were often described by the clinicians as the backbone of their research training, actually, where patients, secretarial staff, and patients basically all sat around. Either, do you think it could be this diagnosis? Do you think it could be that? I was recently reading some papers in this, in the Psychoanalytic Theory Journal that suggests that it might be this. And another clinician would be like, no, but I don't think the transference is working that way. It might be this. And so these kind of, you could think of them as jam sessions, but they were a little bit more systematic than that. And these seminars became so famous that mental health care professionals around the country started coming to New York City to try to dip in and listen because they started hearing about these kind of crazy experimental, this weird clinic in New York City that seems to be, you could say, democratizing therapeutic practice in all sorts of ways, which then I'll just say about the authority question. I think this is another really important thing they stress. They do not think psychoanalysis can ever be an anti-authoritarian project, precisely because they understand, I think correctly, that authority has a really important place in healing. And I know psychoanalysis in general will often get attacked for prioritizing the authority of a clinician. Yeah. But what they really quickly realize is you need authority because you need someone to constrain you to do odd things so that, talking for 50 minutes without stopping like I'm doing right now, in order to get the process going. But there's no rule that says that clinicians have to be the ones who hold that authority.
Yeah.
They want, what they're not looking for is an anti-authoritarian experiment. What they're looking for is we want as much sites of authority as possible in this clinic. We want to multiply the sites of authority as much as possible because we need that to heal. And it's not obvious who is going to form a transference with someone else. This is another part of their radical politics, is that they don't have a sociological determinism.
That was the most interest. I mean, not the most interesting. That was but it was one of the most sort of shocking in some way things to me. Is this sort of conviction, you don't know who transferential bonds are going to be formed with, which I feel like is a really obvious point if you think through the idea of transference in general. And you see it as something that is operative outside of this rigid boundaries of a classical psychoanalytic clinical model. I mean, we see this in our everyday life,
Yeah.
right? We're all teachers, right? Like you never know, like some students are going to get really attached to you. People wander in and out of your life that you're going to cathect,
Yeah.
right? And that are going
Yeah.
to take on oversized importance to you. And, the flip side of that is, you can go see a therapist, and I'm not saying there won't be any sort of transferential anything happening, but sometimes it just doesn't work, right? And so, reading the part of this essay where you're talking about like, well, maybe it's the front desk staff,
Right.
Yeah.
right? It describes something that was so true
Yeah.
as a way of thinking about how people actually navigate institutions, whether they're mental health institutions or not, but sort of noticing that and formalizing it and seeing it as a way of like, oh, okay, so we can multiply,
Right.
to use your language. We can like in our theoretical model take into account the idea that perhaps like the analyst or the doctor or the psychiatrist or whatever you want to call them is not going to be like the primary locus of transference. And that's not only fine, but actually desirable in terms of treating more people. It's the collision of the like extremely apparent with the like theoretically, like how radical that is, that just kind of, I found sort of mind blowing.
I found myself thinking and being blown away by much the same thing. And so I was thinking about like that transferential connection, or well, to take a step back, right? What I see is happening in the way that the clinic in your narration and as we're talking about approached the very material questions of three-dimensional space and the questions of like the very material questions of how do you get paid and like how money as a transactional thing. Like they approach that while trying to produce some sort of encounter, right, that is recognizably psychoanalytic, at least insofar as that is tethered to processes of healing and care and, however much it may involve triage or medication or whatever, that's secondary to that primary impulse of care.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I don't want to necessarily use like the language of like the essential core of psychoanalysis in some ways, because I'm not I don't like that type of essentialism per se, but also in terms of like what I think is like the wisdom or the joy or the treasure of psychoanalysis, like its actual potential to do these things like heal. Clearly, that would involve reconfigurations of things like space and time and et cetera. And as you describe and ground this is a abundantly reflective, at once practical and empirical engagement with questions of resource scarcity and limitations. And the move is of taking the thing that seems to be a scarce resource, and then we'll actually know we're actually hamstrung in some configuration of attachments to like a model that links authority with responsibility, with hierarchy, and then may or may not produce care, right? And the connection I wanted to think here, and like what Abby was saying, is that there is something about whatever we want to call it, like analytic fit or like the condition, whatever the condition of possibility is of analytic rapprochement, like that spark of transference or whatever. That's also, we can think about that as a commodity, right?
Yeah.
Or as a material thing that there can be a real shortage of.
Yeah.
Right. And I think here, like, to give an example that some people in the audience may have experienced in their position as like patients or as clinicians, right? People will sometimes, you can find another doctor, right? Or a clinician says like, this isn't going to work for us. You probably there's a better fit out there, right? And that is a experience which populations like this don't necessarily have the time or the resources to do in a very material way. Mm-hmm. And also too, many of the things that gatekeeper vouchsafe that particular encounter in terms of licensing, in terms of money, in terms of credentials, in terms of all these other institutional things, those may actually be barriers to people who may actually, for real world things, because they're in your community, because they just happen to be there, because of the pure contingencies of life, can actually deliver more of whatever that essential healing, caring operation is to you. And it's just, it's brilliant, I think.
I mean, I want to pick up on Abby's point, because it is true that it should be obvious. And then there's actually an interesting question of what trained their attention on the obvious was that they had to notice it because of their scarce resources. But then it is this amazing breakthrough, because then they realize, well, why does it have to be the physician who is orchestrating the transference? Why couldn't it be another patient?
Yeah.
And they're chit-chatting in the hallway. And if the clinic can be an occasion for transferential bonds to be formed and authority be distributed in such a way that that is possible, then healing is happening. Yeah, you could say at a highly efficient rate. That's obviously not how they would ever talk about it, but they were. It's noticing something what I actually think is so elemental to psychoanalysis, but just looking at it a little bit more closely and seriously, the clinical implications are huge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is that, Abby, you're totally, we don't know who we have fits with. We form bonds with all sorts of people that we don't expect, and we don't form bonds with people we think we're going to form a bond with all the time. And it's a matter of just taking that totally obvious fact and then actually rethinking classical clinical encounters around it.
Yeah.
You have a clinic with lots of people, they're jammed together.
It reminds me, and it's not the same thing, but it reminds me a little bit of when we were talking with Nika Siegel about Fanon's clinical work and talking about the idea of like
Transferential constellation.
the transferential constellation. Yeah, which is a different way, I think, of thinking about some of the same sorts of issues, because I think what you're describing is still often about like a dyad. Like a dyadic structure. It's just a question of sort of like who besides the patient is in that dyad. But there's still both ways of talking about like really fundamental rethinkings of transference without losing the sort of like kernel of it as sort of like the motor energy of what drives change.
I was actually really influenced by the idea of transferential constellation, even because I'd encountered it actually from in Kemi Ropesis's book Disalienation, when she's doing the institutional history of Jean Loury and folks like that. And I think you could actually say that what the clinic, they would, of course, they don't use the language obviously of transferential constellations, but what they do realize is that the environment itself is in many ways the subject of the transference, the totality of the clinical space, from the chairs and the lamps to the other patients waiting, to the physicians in their white coats with their clipboards. All of that is fair game for the formation of some kind of bond which will solicit your speech. And if you put that at the center of curing, the constraints of the clinic are still constraints, but they can be enabling constraints. They could be constraints that let you do things that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise if you had more money or resources.
What I'm thinking about right now, as we've been discussing, is how the Lafargue Clinic represents a space in which, and I hate to use this, I'm going to have to use metaphors that are very like neoliberal or like economizing in some way. But like part of my neoliberally broken brain is hearing it's like we're expanding access to transference, right? But which is... thinking about how cursed that is now, though, I'm realizing that actually gives us some mileage insofar as that what these experiments that kind of de-link traditional associations between credentials, authority, hierarchy, institutions, etc., all this type of stuff, what it seems to suggest is that the norm represents a kind of artificial scarcity or a relationship to the transferential potential, right? Or a relationship to a therapeutic encounter where transference becomes an artificially scarce commodity, and the production of a market where transference like is commoditized and rendered. You know, I don't want to use like a cartel type language, but it's definitely something you can only get from some people. And it's if you take that as like it's the defining feature of a lot of institutional psychoanalysis writ large, that's that has some very serious implications, and I could see why, not in condoning this, right? But I could see why, well, as you describe it, discursive or institutional circuits that are responsible for metabolizing psychoanalysis's history into memory have been privately enclosed by professional associations. We'd want to forget this type of thing, right? And well, I guess even not just that we'd want to forget it, we'd not just people would want it repressed, but then there would be a repression of the repression. And so I guess to tie a bow on this, there's something going on here between these themes of like, well, I guess even as you've said, of like unlearning things that you've learned, but also of coming to see things that are right in front of you or that should be obvious, combined with these extremely sophisticated, but also apparently quite fragile, or at least ostensibly fragile, mechanisms for foreclosing possibility, for not seeing certain things, for disavowing history, and for not even realizing that those operations had happened in the first place.
I mean, there is an interesting question why you could spin one of their discoveries. It's because it's not a discovery. It's just realizing that there's, you can use the neoliberal language that this is like a commodity that's everywhere, but you could also talk about it as natural abundance. That maybe there's a realization that we're the kinds of creatures who have access to this kind of patterning of bonding. And there's something about the history of institutional psychoanalysis that blocked viewing or understanding or appreciating a natural abundance of connectivity that can be turned in all sorts of ways. And all they did was notice it first and foremost.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I've been thinking a lot in my own work on psychoanalysis and pedagogy. I've been trying to think about like how we might theorize lay analysis, not in the way that Freud talked about it in the sense of like you have to be a medical doctor in order to become a psychoanalyst, but like how we can think about other institutional sites where there is generally a dyadic sort of relation that produces in some sort of reliable way produces like change. I don't know. So that's something that I've been thinking about. And to me, this was really generative in the sort of the like chutzpah of just being like, yeah, like maybe it's not going to be the doctor. Maybe it is going to be the person that checks you in, and that's fine.
Right.
And that's all to the good.
It could even be both. It could be maybe your
Both
bond
and, yeah.
efficient depends on, like, because I think we experience it in this classroom too. When the students have good chemistry with each other, their learning from each other and from you is also enormously expanded.
Multiplied.
Exactly.
Exactly.
It's multiplied. It's capacitating in ways you couldn't have understood in the beginning. And I think that's the right analogy. That the clinicians are realizing, they say this, it's amazing. They say it explicitly over and over in their memos. Everyone in this clinic, regardless of whether they're a physician, needs a little bit of knowledge in psychotherapy because everyone has a role to play in psychotherapy. And we all will need to depend on each other to do this crazy experiment.
Yes.
Which is exactly what we say to our students.
It's exactly it. And you're giving me a really beautiful segue to ask you about what I would call this sort of like psychosocial dimension of the clinic, or at least the ways that it seems like that everybody at the Lafargue was in agreement that part of mental health doesn't involve, kind of thinking about the individual as this atomized unit, but actually requires working with people to understand their own material conditions. So it seems to me, as you're describing the therapeutic work at Lafargue, it's inextricably bound up with this orientation towards material realities. And this has theoretical implications, but also practical implications. So there's this notion that you have of situational neuroses, and also this distinction between false consciousness of class and the functioning of class as a thing that can be unconscious. So you write, and now I'm going to quote you, that the clinic emphasized that, quote, patients needed to understand their location in the social totality. They needed help placing their suffering in a materialist and not only personal point of view, close quote. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about these ideas and also about how they represent an effort to merge Marxist and Freudian approaches and concerns. So how does what you call the will to survive relate to capitalist conditions? In what way does fostering that will differ from or go beyond care work? And finally, and this is me asking you to unpack my favorite line of the essay, what does it mean to say that, quote, political organizing is a species of dream interpretation?
Sure. I'm glad you like that part. It's a part that is close to my heart. Maybe I'll start with the why they're trying to bring Freud and Marx together. What does that even mean? How does it relate to this notion that class might be unconscious rather than just false? The one direction is that they're clearly trying to use Marx to modify what they think are the blind spots of Freud. What they really mean by this is just a really blasé attitude that psychiatric care in New York City has towards living conditions, actually, in particular. So Harlem is dense, overcrowded. Tenement housing is in the process of being demolished in order for some of the first high-rise luxury condos to be constructed. And part of it has to do, I'll bring up a particular case. The psychiatric case files are full of this. A woman who thought that neighbors were throwing fumes at her. Those are her words, that my neighbors are throwing fumes at me. And the clinicians, they take this very seriously as a kind of a possible auditory or olfactory illusion, even. But they're also like, she lives in really crowded housing. I mean, actually. And it would be kind of bananas to explain that this has to do with repressed daddy issues without noticing the fact that she lives in a building that currently houses 4 times as many people as was originally designed to house. There's similarly, the very first patient they ever have, a young woman, I think 19, who comes to the clinic, has anxiety and suicidal thoughts. But it turns out that she's also sharing her bed with 2 of her sisters in a really tiny apartment in Harlem and has really terrible living conditions. And I think just at a very basic dimension, they take family history very seriously and personal history very seriously, but they're also convinced that actual things in your material conditions are what make certain parts of your past matter neurotically or not. So maybe you do have daddy issues, but maybe the daddy issues matter because you actually don't even have your own room, and that you don't even have enough private space, or that you just lost your job. And the situational neurosis was their way of talking about that real material situations might be what make certain parts of your life history pathological or not. And it would be kind of bananas to put someone on the couch and not notice anything about the neighborhood that they live in. That said, what I also like about the way that they try to merge Freud and Marx is that, and this connects to the will to survive, they also know that, so when they constantly say that when they're treating their patients, they want their patients to acquire a knowledge of what you could call their social location in the economy broadly. And they do this partly because they don't want people to think that their neuroses are out of just their personal histories, but they interact with the larger world. And they're attentive to the fact, though, that at the end of the day, this person must suffer as them. And that's why they need the Freud to modify Marx. So it's not enough to tell people you're neurotically suffering, but by the way, it's a symptom of capitalist domination. But that doesn't help them understand, but why is it me who has to suffer now? Why am I the one who has to suffer in this way at this time and this place? And maybe I do have the knowledge of my social location, but that is not the knowledge I need as the person who is currently experiencing that oppression. And it's the will to survive. It's this notion that pops up in their writings a fair bit, that what they want to instill in many of their patients is a will to survive in a hostile capitalist world. And there's a way of reading that as like neoliberal grit culture.
Right.
Like I've actually gotten that response a number of power through, maximize your productivity, go to work even though you're suffering.
Yeah. We were just talking about the critique of resilience with Ajay Chaudhry that I
Right.
feel like comports really, really well with that.
No, and I think it's true that there's a way of reading their language of the will to survive as a variation of resilience. But there's another way of reading it, which I prefer to take, which is that they're taking seriously that it is at the level of the will of the patient that they are suffering these structural forces. And regardless of how systematic their form of domination might be, it is their will that has to be the starting point of enduring, of becoming self-organizing themselves. And so the bringing of the Freud and Marx, I think, it really has a lot to do with both wanting their patients to not personalize their problems, but honoring the fact that it is they and not someone else who is suffering, and it is they and not someone else who is having night terrors or auditory illusions or feeling anxiety whenever they see something. I mean, when you read the psychiatric case files, some of the neurotic debilitation is so severe, and you just have to think that the clinicians are like, I want this person to understand that it has to do with the fact that they live in Harlem, but that does nothing to the fact that they are suffering in this way at this time, and that's what they're here for.
Right. So there's this sort of thoroughgoing structural understanding of the material causes of suffering without sacrificing anything of the singularity of the individual who suffers as they suffer.
Yeah. I'm not sure they do it perfectly, but it's all over their writings. They know that this is the balancing act that has to somehow be done successfully if we're going to pull this off.
I don't know. I'm wondering, I don't know if it could be done perfectly, right? That seems like talk about like doubling the workload of the impossible in the impossible profession, right? You both have to
use the neoliberal language. That's a heavy lift.
Yeah, can't optimize for that. But I find myself going back. I'm thinking about the way in which a clinician or these people all together in this space, right, are together processing something or are together working with something, right? As subjects under capitalism, as suffering in their own different ways, right? And I can imagine. I'm curious about the ways in which perhaps some of the clinicians would feel ground down by this, or the dynamics that might happen between them, right? I think, but I'm also just thinking about the capacity to toggle back and forth between immediate triage and on the level of meds, and then on the level of housing, and then on the level of an interpretation, right? But also knowing that an interpretation, can misfire if it's an interpretation in the classic way that an interpretation misfires in an analytic sense, but also in the way in which, like, an ideological appeal, telling someone that they have false consciousness doesn't cure them of having false consciousness either, much in the same way as telling someone that they're neurotic doesn't necessarily make them feel better, and in fact can make them feel worse, right?
Right.
It's this work of impossible talking between the singular and the particular, between what you are the familiar, comforting even, or safe institutional and norms and hierarchies and logics of authority that you came up in and that you identified with. And it seems only to be practicable, however evanescently or unsustainably, through the participation of many people in it at once, kind of forming, again, it's more than just a safety net, though it is that. It's also this sort of like network of, well, whatever it is, it's not zero sum.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be about individuals atomistically being depleted, or a sovereign individual having a interpretation that they can sort of deliver. And I think part of what is so remarkable to me what I'm finding so remarkable in this is thinking about these quote unquote research sessions, as opposed to, I don't know, like the case conference, right? Where someone reads the note and the patient isn't there, but it's the way in which the hierarchy, just for the audience, right? A training analyst or an analyst in training brings forward notes to read to other people who are in training while there's a supervisor there and maybe some other bigwigs. And like it can be its own sort of fraud enterprise too. But implicit in that are so many logics, like you are colleagues and here are aspirant colleagues, apprentices, et cetera. Whereas what is happening here is literally understood as research. And that research seems to be research into the individual subjective conditions and sufferings of the patient who is present, or of the person who's present, but also just sort of like a collective inquiry into coexisting in this kind of fractalized experience of suffering under capitalism, which other modes of capitalist like sociality and therapy would not want us to have. It's simply just coming together in this way and abiding that seems to be so profoundly generative.
I can't say how, they are really acutely aware that they don't know how successful they are. They do a lot of self-assessment, and they're like, we're having a hard time understanding how much we're healing.
Mm-hmm.
But your remark about them abiding together, it gets to the quotation that Abby flagged about the political organizing being a species of dream interpretation. I think anyone who's done organizing before knows that what you do when you're organizing someone is that you're not revealing their false consciousness and giving them true consciousness. What you're doing is giving them permission to want something.
Mm-hmm.
And that is absolutely what these clinicians also view themselves as doing. They're like, we're not giving you this information about your location in the social totality so that you can have true consciousness of the exact laws of accumulation. We're giving you permission to want better than what you have. It's hard reading these, a therapist knows this, but even just as someone who's reading these psychiatric case files, their patients are self-sabotaging. And explaining the social origins of why they self-sabotage does not change the fact that they experience their oppression as of their own authorship.
Yes.
They are the ones who keep, for whatever reason, not showing up to the job that seems like it's like there's no obstacle and yet they don't show up. It's like, why are you self-sabotaging this way? You can give the structural explanation. You have to give the structural explanation, but they're the ones who are destroying their own lives.
Yeah.
And a lot of what the clinicians are doing, I think, when they do the will to survive is similar to what an organizer does, which is like, I'm not giving you new wishes. I don't know what your wishes are, but I am trying to give you permission to want something that you didn't give yourself permission to want before. And that requires a lot of people around you also give you permission to want the thing that you didn't think you were allowed to want because it was wrong to want, because you're not the right type of class to want it, not the right type of demographic group that you're not. These are just in some ways desires that are prescribed. And so the relationship there between the reason they don't talk about false consciousness, but class unconsciousness is because the relationship isn't between knowing and not knowing, but between whether you're willing to wish or not. And it's not clear what the wish is going to be, but a lot of what their patients do is they're part of their reason that a lot of the cases that these folks seem trapped is because they did it. It sounds banal. They repeat because they can't see otherwise. They self-sabotage and they are somehow consigned to the fate that they will always self-sabotage themselves. There is something much closer to the relationship between what an organizer does and what these clinicians are trying to do than the classic model that is implied by false consciousness. And I know most psychoanalysts didn't subscribe to it, but the idea that you could explain someone's neurosis to them and therefore the memory is recovered and therefore they get better. It was they knew really clearly it wasn't like that.
It seems like, just to go back to an earlier kind of fork in this, what the staff and doctors at the clinic were calling situational neuroses is sort of like what we would call like a discrete trauma. Does that seem true? It's an interesting phrase, and it feels like it does a lot of really useful work, kind of mediating between these two things, which is like there are reasons that are out of control for like why you feel this way, and yet also you must come to deal with it. Right. So like the idea of, right, because like no one else is going to.
Right. I think that's totally it. And I haven't been able to fully figure this out. I mean, Ernst Jolovich is using the phrase situational neurosis in Germany before he has to flee the Nazis. So it goes back a bit. But a lot of the clinicians are reading really closely existential psychoanalysis. That's situation that comes out of that. Like you don't get to pick the situation you were thrown in, but sorry, it's on you to figure out what you're actually going to do now that you've been thrown into that situation.
Yeah.
There's something of that in the way that they also approach these neuroses, that because of forces totally outside of your control, you live on this block and you're suffering as a result. Sucks to be you, sorry, basically, but this is what we have to work with. And you must find, and we will be there as you figure out the resources you may have in order to at least not completely collapse and to self-sabotage yourself into oblivion.
Yeah.
Some of the situational neuroses are definitely actually traumas. For war, a lot of the patients at the clinic are war veterans.
Yeah.
There's some pretty amazing dream sequences that they describe that are directly related to them imagining from alternative perspectives, like their own warships getting hit. Like they're inside the warship, but they're having dreams of watching their warship get hit while they're inside of it. So there are actual cases like that. And then there are situational neuroses that are as simple as I got a divorce.
Yeah.
And I have to move. And the habits that I've developed to get by for the last 15 years have suddenly fallen apart, which has then activated like a whole chain of neurotic debilitations that now I can't seem to get any under control anymore. It spans the whole range.
I don't want to get too woo about this. Like I keep on thinking about this theme of contingency and like and then well the theme of contingency on the one hand, and then like the erasure of certain contingencies or the erasure of certain recurrent things or certain the will to survive or whatever in favor of the construction of a false logic of necessity. But just the contingencies that we're talking about, I always go back to like what I take to be one of Freud's like major dilemmas, conceptual but like existential, right? And which is so hard to read in his early studies on hysteria, which is like, why did this particular person become traumatized at this time? Like, why this trauma? Right. And implicit in that is this recognition. Well, actually, there's tons of incest. There's tons of sexual abuse. There are tons of people who walk around all day without having the same, we call them florid, or at least the same self-destructive or incredibly destructive symptoms. Right. So there's like that contingency, you know, and and Freud will of course have his theory of like, there's a previous trauma, and then there's a whole series of like things that have to, well, go wrong, I guess, or be bad in this contingent way. And then that's the straw that breaks the camel's back, or the blow that lands.
Right.
And then also there's this contingency that we're talking about in terms of, well, the contingency of transference, right? The contingency of the capacity to heal.
Or to connect.
Yeah, to connect. Yeah, or even to like, what I'm thinking about is, it's so hard to be able to talk about this in terms of its, or to schematize it in terms of its the earnest way in which these contingencies can wound, right? And can come together in a specific way. But also, I think it's imperative to talk about the way in which political and economic and social conditions have a way of generating more and more of the same kinds of contingent capacities for trauma for certain categories of people, right? And regulating capacities too for encounters for healing. That these are all, they coexist in this way.
There's this amazing case. Amazing is not the right word.
Fascinating
case of one of the patients who was convinced he had a congenital case of syphilis, but the doctors couldn't diagnose anything. But he was convinced because of various symptoms that he had syphilis, and he was convinced it was because when he was in a canteen as a soldier, he was the only Black soldier in the canteen, and someone gave him a dirty look like 30 years ago. And he was convinced that somehow was related to his congenital syphilis, which on one hand is so contingent and so obviously patterned. And it would be futile to try to sort out the patterning from the contingency, because the whole structure of the symptom is the collision of epic contingency with epic patterning. And it's like, and you keep reading these cases and it's just like that. It's like, you could never, why is this their symptom? And yet, the more you read the case, it's like they were at the wrong time in the wrong place. It happened to be them. But if it wasn't them, it would have been someone else, because this was pattern too. You know, and it's, I think you're right that it's hard to hold together, but I think it's amazing to watch them try to do it. And I can see why frankly, both certain parts of the Marxist left at the time and the psychoanalysts were like, what is this clinic trying to do? Like, what they're trying to do is impossible. And maybe it was impossible. But the absolute randomness of these patients' illness, with the fact that, of course, they're all in Harlem, which is not an accident.
It seems, I think here too I'm thinking about the ways in which, I'm thinking actually about Gabe Winant's stuff about like organizing, but also things that Gabe has said in some of his interviews that we'll link to. But and there's a line that almost comes close to saying almost exactly the same. I think one of the people that you quote in the paper, I won't rustle too many pages looking to find it. But if we have like all these bad contingencies that are flowering right across the capitalist hellscape intergenerationally, and part of how they work, well, a defining feature of how they work seems to be this kind of isolating character of it, right? Both it's you alone, it's your failure, you did something wrong, that's why you're poor, or there's the isolating, the ways in which what connection there is filtered through institutions where it's only ever going to be a dyad, and maybe you save up to see one clinician, and then it turns out there's no fit, and now you're fucked, and you're not going to go back, right? Like all those contingencies are being shaped and kind of like over determined so that certain causal outcomes are weighted, and under the sign, above all, of like zero-sum logics, individual alienation, healing care is a commodity you have to fight for or win. There's something so beautiful about taking the fact of contingency and being, well, what if we just multiply the capacity for other contingent encounters to come together and just see what happens? And in a way, I think this is why I'm thinking about Gabe's work and about histories of interracial organizing, right? It's part of the I would even call it like the glory or the human beauty of a lot of political work is that it changes you as you do it. The struggle is what changes you. And I think
Right.
that means meeting other people. That means working in a plural mode and accepting other plural possibilities for your own life, however they may have been foreclosed by, real things from illness to your historical position to your income tax bracket. But there is this way in which like the multiplication of over and against finite resources, just allowing for more and more connection changes the people in the process. And that seems to work just as well for organizing as for psychotherapy at this. It seems to be this upshot, or at least that's a crucial ingredient or condition of possibility for both.
No, it's true that I've actually read accounts where people describe organizing work as a form of therapy, which I actually think is not quite right, though.
Yeah.
Because it's not organizing as a form of therapy, as if the organizer is a therapist and the person being organized is a patient. It's that the kind of work, this kind of self-transformation that happens in organizing is also the kind of self-transformation that happens in a therapeutic encounter, which is, so and again, it's not about who has authority, who doesn't. It's about there's an authority that is born that didn't exist before.
Yes.
And that's exactly why I think that early phrase that Earl Brown says that this is one of the most democratic places on earth, and this is not an overstatement, I totally buy, because you could read that as saying there is a form of collective authority and empowerment here that is born that did not exist before these people came together. It's not quite something from nothing, but it's almost. There are transferential non-connections being formed that only happen because these people are now in this space together, and they are capacitating themselves in ways they couldn't have had without this clinical space together. And it is about producing authority in subjects who didn't have any before, paradoxically, by also being constrained by other people whose authority is born in the encounter too. And you could, if you wanted, to say that there's a little allegory here about a different vision of democratic power that is being born out of the clinical space in microcosmic form that has nothing to do with the form of democracy that is being consolidated in the United States during the Cold War. And if you run with that thought, then it's pretty amazing.
Wool-gatheringly, but one thing that I was also thinking about reading your piece, I do this weird course on repression, right? Which is both like repression as a concept, but then repression is like counterinsurgency technique. And I do this kind of like occult history of psychoanalytic theory into basically colonial policing and then domestic stuff in the core, right? But the reason I'm saying this is because the only other thing that I can think of that has undergone a similar, not just like a repression at the time, but then a forgetting of the forgetting, was essentially the left-wing, massive social dislocation. Like I think like Elizabeth Hinton's work, like America on Fire, right? Like literal like uprisings across the country, and the ways in which what the state basically did, right, was like everyone, all these leaders who had this institutional knowledge, and I don't want to say draw it one-to-one between them and like training analysts, right? But basically anyone who had had applied Marxist theory and some degree of like quote unquote urban guerrilla chops either wound up getting like killed, in prison, or got tenure. And there's something about the capacity. I'm just thinking of like undercapitalized people coming together and doing something other than being fucking miserable or killing one another. It can't be allowed to stand in some way. And it has to be not just like dismantled and under at the moment, it has to be forgotten and then kind of disseminated, and then something else has to come in to take its place. Right. And so there's something about this, like, I don't know, like just in my own experience, like the way in which like literally people only talk about Martin Luther King and then they forget like the Black Liberation Army and everything else. Right. And even though Martin Luther King isn't actually Martin Luther King, here it's like, we have this, the psychoanalysts of the 50s were all ego psychologists, and they were all adapting to go to work. And it's just like, it seems to feel a force. There's a necessity here.
Yeah.
That actually totally checks out, because actually, you know what, the other origin story you could say of why I even fell into this train was the late realization that I'm now sure is 100% true, which is the most dedicated readers of Freud were the anti-colonial generation. They read Freud, and I was like, but that was totally repressed because it was assimilated to the history of eco-psychology and the Professional Psychoanalytic Association. I was like, but what would happen to our history of psychoanalysis if we just foregrounded what seems to me like a screamingly obvious fact that the people who most cared about the concept of the unconscious and repression were literally the people analyzing the cost of cultural assimilation. Like it would, and then I was like, oh, wait, but that actually totally screws up with what I thought I understood about this period, that maybe the people who read Freud most closely are also the ones who I then never got assigned ever again. maybe it still awaits its historical account about what happened. Maybe they did just get tenure. I don't know. But it rocked my world when I realized that it was these various anti-colonial Black and Caribbean radicals and European emigres, and not the professional associations, who almost none of whom had physicians' degrees.
Yeah.
Or just dissecting this stuff.
Well, I think you may have just begun to anticipate my last question here, which is about some of the framing that you use pretty early on in the piece, where you note, quite poignantly that the story of the Lafargue Clinic has been forgotten, or if we're all speaking psychoanalysis right now, we're not going to miss an opportunity to say that it's been repressed. So, can we talk about how and why it has, as you write, ceased to exist as a memory? And also, what in the recovery of this story seems vital to you now? You say, we repeat because we want to change, and that the key thing is to repeat differently. So the question I really want to open up is, how might you envision repeating what the Lafargue Clinic exemplified today? And, another way of asking that is, as you pose this idea of broke psychoanalysis, like what might that look like now?
Oof.
You wrote it. I'm just putting this together.
I'll actually start with the repeating with the difference, because I think it's really important that we repeat with the difference.
Uh-huh.
I love the history of the Lafargue Clinic. I've spent now so much time with them, but I also don't want to romanticize them.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to be romanticized.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of other doctors and patients wanted to mimic them.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically said, you can try it, but maybe don't, because they understood that there was something unscalable about what they were doing. So, for example, they all have other full-time jobs. We do not want a world of free clinics where people are working overtime, right? So I always worry about romanticizing the history of the clinic, because they knew that what they were doing was often a form of triage, and that a society of flourishing people would not be a society that depended on clinics run and overtime. So what we obviously, or I want from them, I mean, partly it's this beautiful vision of self-organizing people that gives birth to forms of authority that didn't exist before, people coming together. I mean, I really have come to lean hard in this. Psychoanalysis isn't the only tradition that emphasizes this, but that authority is not the opposite, is not just constraint. That authority can be capacitating for people in order to gain their own form of authority over their own lives and over their collective fates. And you could say that maybe what draws me to the clinic is that something like the wish has to be saved from the reality to which it was actually subject to, which was the old Freudian 1918 psychotherapy for the people. We talked earlier about a possible natural abundance of connective possibilities that psychoanalysis is really attentive to. But as part of me wants to also think of psychoanalysis as a form of communal luxury, that you wouldn't want overworked clinicians providing this. You'd want this to be something that is a natural abundance too. Why it's repressed, though? I mean, I think we all might know some of the classic culprits, which I think are probably true, which is the rise of pharmacological treatment. I mean, even if you want to keep thinking materially, the talking cure is so labor intensive. What insurance companies wanted to seriously cover it? I mean, when versus the rise of pharmacological treatments that seem to get you more bang for your buck, you might say. I totally admit to being shocked that when I visited St. Philip's recently, that it's not just that they some of the folks knew of the clinic barely. They didn't know its name. They were so kind to me. They handed me a book that the church published on its own of the history of the church. And there's a whole page dedicated to the clinic, except it actually gets a couple of facts wrong too, at least based on the records that I was examining. And so it blows my mind that the clinic's practically underneath their feet, and yet they don't remember this own incredible experiment. And it must be because it was partly a victim of the repression of the history of radical psychoanalysis in general. One maybe nice thing to note is that I think it was just last month that there was a series of film showings in Harlem at one of the theaters around the legacy of the clinic and its connections to communist politics and Harlem in the 50s. So maybe we're at a moment in which this history is kind of flashing back. But it is, the reason the clinic's not remembered. I mean, I also want to say that one other reason I think the clinic's not well remembered is frankly because there's a lot of attention given to the fact that the clinic was affiliated with Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison. But then the follow-up to that is everyone that focuses on Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison. Mm-hmm. And I actually really do care about the clinicians, like Wortham's papers, Hilda Moss's papers, Ernst Jolovich's paper, Andre Tweed's papers. They capture a lot more of my interest than, it matters to me, obviously, that very famous writers are affiliated with the clinic. But then whenever people end up writing about the clinic, they end up writing about the psychoanalytic dimensions of Richard Wright's novels.
Can I ask you a very selfish question then, since you've opened this door? One of these clinicians I had never heard of, but it's Bronislawa Langrod.
Oh, I thought you were going to. As a Polish person, I thought you were going to.
Yeah, as a person of Polish persuasion, I would like to know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know nothing about her, and her story sounds amazing.
So what I know is her application form with the Lafargue Clinic, which has some of her basic biographical facts, as well as her obituary. It must have been the New York Times. It's very tiny. So what I know of her is coupled between her application materials and her obituary. That's true of a ton of these ultra radical clinicians who are fleeing the Nazis. I'm sure if I kept scrounging, I can find more stuff. I haven't been systematic about it. But so Langrod, Bronislawa, what an amazing, just based on what I have, what an insane, amazing, like anti-fascist psychoanalyst, fleeing from the Gestapo, ending up at the Lafargue Clinic, applying to do anti-fascist psychoanalysis there. Just seems to have, based on the obituary, seems to have lived out her days in New York City practicing. But if she's amazing, but she's part of this whole world of, and, I wonder whether the professional associations really remember these folks too. They must have been so odd compared to the American psychoanalysts hanging around in New York City, explicit in their anti-fascism, explicit in their affiliation with the European socialist politics, committed that psychoanalysis had an anti-fascist project behind it, not because it was anti-authoritarian, but because it had a different understanding of how authority could promote human flourishing rather than repress it. And I wish I could tell you more. She's one of I included her in the essay just because I'm like, I want someone to figure out, maybe if I have time, I'll go chase it down. I want to figure out some of these amazing clinicians who keep popping up all over the records, but only in passing.
Well, perhaps if there's someone listening to this podcast who has some knowledge about this, perhaps someone even whose Polish is better than my diminishing Polish, this could be something we could look into. But I just wanted to say that I think another joy I had with this paper was just coming across these names and being like, oh, I need to find a copy of this book. Oh, I've never heard of this person. Mm-hmm. And just this,
same.
It wasn't daunting. It wasn't in a way that maybe it was because of all the contingent details of these biographies, right? Being the anti-Gestapo partisan to this clinic in Harlem. It's wild. But also I think it's the way you assembled the multiple stories into a story. And it was incredibly generative for me. And I found myself, really wanting to read more. And I'm confident that other people are going to want to read more.
People in the business, as we all are, of making meaning with words, I think it can actually be really depressing to have access to almost everything that's been written, because so much of it is like it turns out to be a slog, and there was something that was just like so crystalline about your essay that I'm really excited to assign it as well. And so now I want to ask you about the book that might be in process. I know that it has something to do with surrealism. Can you tell us a little bit before we go about what you're working on now?
Totally. It is going to eventually become a book, so you can keep your eye out on it. Although, and I am very happy to say that I am so lucky to have just signed on with a literary agent. to do this.
Awesome.
The Lafargue Clinic, you can probably tell from the way even that the piece is written, I want to plot as part of an international story
Mm-hmm.
of really politically committed psychoanalysts the mid-century who have actually tenuous connections with each other. And it's exactly like we were talking about. I want to gather them up because I think the fact that they didn't get to fully be gathered up at their own time is part of the injustice that generation suffered.
Yeah.
So the book actually starts with the uptake of Freud by the Surrealists in France, because they're among the first people to read Freud seriously, because the psychiatric establishment in France, which is basically an arm of this state, is deeply hostile to Freudian psychoanalysis in general. They're very committed to still like a neurobiological model that they inherited from the 19th century. The Surrealists understand that aspect of psychoanalysis, which is that it ought to humble Europeans about what they think they have done. All those lines that Freud always says that there should be an insult to our concept of civilization, the fact that we have all these unconscious desires, all his remarks on the war, where he explicitly says, this war should reveal to us not that Europeans have fallen so low, but that we were never really so high in the first place. The Surrealists immediately understand that the political import of psychoanalysis is that it immediately levels civilizational hierarchies. And they run with it. And so the book first charts the story of the way that Surrealists started reading Freud seriously and turning it into a self-critique of a European intellectual generation, but that it very quickly actually becomes the lingua franca of anti-colonialism. So in particular, the way in which the book focuses on Aimé and Suzanne Césaire and their antifascist journal Tropique in Martinique under Vichy rule, and their encounter with the French surrealists who show up on the island fleeing Europe, and the kind of explosion, big bang they all have when they realize that surrealism might have something to tell us about the nature of anti-colonial struggle in general. And then they all, on that boat that carries the surrealists over to first the Caribbean and then the United States, is also Claude Lévi-Strauss, the father of structuralism and structural anthropology.
No shit.
Who says that it's the surrealists who taught him his method of early structuralism, of collating things that look like they're not alike and noticing the patterns, connecting them.
Wow.
Who then all end up in New York City, where the Lafargue Clinic also is, who also has some staff members who fled on this boat. And I'm trying to tell this, like, this is an amazing tiny slice of psychoanalysis history that never gets told as the history of psychoanalysis, but has everything to do with the way that Freud might have given this generation the lingua franca for understanding the forms of migration and displacement and fascism that they were all enduring, and to develop an anti-colonial vocabulary to answer it. So that's the idea of the book. And the Lafargue Clinic is one of many people of this generation who are just doing things we didn't think you could do with Freud. That's the rough idea of the book.
That's awesome. I can't wait.
That's amazing. Yeah. Kevin, I'm so excited to read the book when it exists in physical form, and anything else that you write. This has been such a delight. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for taking the time. I know it was a lot of time, so I appreciate it.
Can't wait. I hope we can have you back for anything else that you want to do sometime, because I honestly...
This was so fun.
Anything you read, I'm going to read at this point. So...
Thank you for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. If you need more OU in your life, and or if you would like to support us, because this podcast is entirely made possible by the generosity of our Patreon supporters. And if you subscribe, you will get 2 additional Patreon episodes per month, including 1 installment of the standard edition, as we slowly but steadily make our way through the entirety of Freud's standard edition, as well as 1 installment of our Wild Analysis series, where we put culture on the couch. You can find us at patreon.com/ordinary unhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Kevin Duong. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.